The last speaker is Dr. Vienna Brown. Dr. Brown is a biologist with the National Feral Swine Disease Management Program, where she oversees the National Feral Swine Disease Surveillance and Research activities. Dr. Brown earned her Bachelor's of Science in Animal Science from Colorado State University and a Master's of Public Health from the University of Colorado, Denver, with a PhD in microbiology from Colorado State as well. All right, Dr. Brown, you can take it away.
Great, thank you. Awesome. Thanks so much for.
There's the advancer. There's the pointer if you need it.
All right. I got stuff in both hands, so thanks so much for the opportunity and for the welcome. I'm Vienna Brown. I'm a staff biologist. I guess you just said all this, but I'm going to talk about feral swine today. And both Miranda and Ryan gave a pretty good intro to feral swine and why they're a problem, and a pretty good depiction of where they are within the continental U.S. So I always err on the side of too many slides and too much information, so I'm gonna have to kind of bowl through it, but at least it'll wet your whistle on feral swine issues, and then you can reach out with questions or comments down the road. So. Feral swine, they are heavily populated in the southeast U.S. So Texas, Oklahoma, and that whole southeast seaboard is pretty dense feral swine populations, largely contiguous. California is kind of a standalone in terms of high density populations across much of the state. And then, as Dr. Brook mentioned, there's kind of these one-off pockets that looks like pigs can fly, which of course they can't, and so those are almost exclusively a product of either anthropogenic movement or escaped domestics or from a high fence operation. From a why do we care about feral swine perspective, they are hugely problematic. They cause damage and destruction to pretty much everything that they get into. From an agricultural perspective, they either directly predate on almost every crop species, as well as causing damage and economic losses from their rooting and wallowing and trampling behaviors. From a damage to property perspective, they are known to root in golf courses and cemeteries and archaeological sites, causing lots of damage to many historical areas. From a natural resources perspective, they often outcompete native fauna for food. They are often, they're heavily tied to water from a biological perspective, so they're often in riparian areas, which of course fuel biodiversity, and so feral swine cause a lot of problems there. They eat salamanders, eggs of ground nesting birds, so they're just really kind of in everything. And then of course they pose a risk to humans and other animals, both from a physical damage perspective in terms of attacks, but then also from a disease and foreign animal disease perspective. So National Feral Swine Program was stood up in 2014 through a congressional appropriation, so that we are rounding out our 9th federal fiscal year. Our baseline funding is loosely tethered to populations. And so our 4 highest density states, California, Texas, Oklahoma, and Florida, receive our highest baseline funding, then next level 4 states, level 3, level 2. And so as you can see, the majority of our appropriated funding is tethered to the southeast, which is where the majority of our feral swine populations are found. In 2018, our appropriated dollars were augmented by the 2018 Farm Bill. So our normal appropriated budget sits around $32.5 million, and then from 2018 through 2023, we had an additional $37.5 million. And so these are no-year funds, so they were able to be dispersed across that 5-year time period. And so we stood up 34 projects in 12 states. And so it was a total of $75 million that was to be split between APHIS, Wildlife Services, and the National Resource Conservation Service to do. Wildlife Services is doing feral swine damage management through lethal control, and then NRCS was doing trap loan programs for local landowners, and then providing restoration mitigation to feral swine impacted areas. So that's kind of a really fast, broad strokes of kind of how the funding for the national program works, and how the majority of those funds are pushed out to the states to do lethal removal of feral swine. So I'm going to talk briefly about our national surveillance efforts in feral swine, then move into our ASF control and preparedness activities. But I do think it's important to have kind of a baseline of where we are doing operational control and then where we're sampling and doing surveillance at this time. So in 2021, we kind of revamped our national surveillance efforts. So it's predicated as a foreign animal disease surveillance system. And we're specifically focused around classical swine fever, African swine fever, and foot and mouth disease. From our surveillance approach perspective, we are doing active surveillance in the form of antibody surveillance for classical swine fever. So we're taking blood samples, spitting those down, and looking for antibodies for CSF. For ASF, across the whole of the feral swine invaded range, we're doing morbidity mortality surveillance, although we are doing active surveillance in some specific areas, which we'll talk about later. And then for FMD, we're doing active observational surveillance. We ask our field biologists, as they're collecting samples and filling out metadata forms, to take a quick look along the tongue, gums, mouth, snout, hooves, for any evidence of vesicular lesion. And we triage any morbidity mortality cases or evidence of vesicular lesions through our partners in veterinary services as part of a foreign animal disease workup. The risk factors that go into determining how a county is prioritized as either low, medium, or high priority are based on two primary factors. The first are risk of introduction. So we're looking at airline passenger cargo data, as well as mail interdiction data, and the presence of landfills, seaports, and airports. So we are able to weigh those in relation to the host risks. So for CSF and ASF, we're looking specifically at domestic swine production. And then for FMD, we're looking at all host stock production. And then we overlay that with feral swine populations. And then every county within the US that has a feral swine population is given a county prioritization from a surveillance perspective. This, like I said, started at the start of fiscal year 21. It was a huge lift and really was kind of a revamp in how we approached our feral swine national surveillance activities. But one of the things that has come to be really, really handy is it can be easily updated to address emerging threats. And so we rolled this out in October of 20, right before ASF showed up in the Western Hemisphere. And so we've been able to really kind of piggyback off of the existence of this surveillance to account for our risk for ASF introduction. We are continuing to integrate monitoring of production diseases. So we are doing antibody-based diagnostics for both pseudorabies and swine brucellosis. And then we doubled our sample size to a minimum of 6,000. So that gets us right around a 1% detection rate for CSF, which of course is the OIE standard for surveillance. So this is fiscal years 2018 through 2022. These are our 3 diseases of national concern. You can see a big jump between 20 and 21 from our sample number perspective. But for classical swine fever, quite predictably, we haven't had any samples that have tested antibody positive, which is good because it's a foreign animal disease. For pseudorabies, our national seroprevalence for feral swine bounces between about 17.5% and 25%. And for swine brucellosis, bounces between about 5.5% and 15%. So if we look at, those were the national aggregates, then we look at the state aggregates. I'm going to break down the data further to the county level. But what's important to note is we do not see homogeneous distribution of those pathogens across the landscape. So if we look at Texas, for example, for pseudorabies virus, this is an aggregate of fiscal year 2022. At the state scale, we see Texas with seropositivity around over 25% are feral swine, which is greater than it is for our national average. However, if you look at Texas at the county level, you see hot pockets and you see much less hot pockets. So you'll notice we do not have uniform distribution of sampling across the state. And this is a product of where we are asked to work pigs. So Wildlife Services is non-regulatory. We work at the pleasure of the landowner. And so we are doing damage management and then doing opportunistic surveillance on the top of that. We target within an opportunistic framework, but we do not have equal access to pigs. But what's important to note here is that we see counties that are very high levels of pseudorabies exposure right next to counties that have very low or no levels. And my guess is that if we were able to get data at the sounder level, we would see sounders with close to 100% and sounders with close to 0%. So when we talk to producers or our partners in veterinary services, and we're thinking about production, domestic swine production, we definitely want to err on the side of caution that every feral swine has every pathogen out there. But when we look at the data from an epidemiological perspective, the risk is not uniform. We see a similar pattern. Sorry, this is annoying. I don't have a pocket to put this in. No, it's fine. Is it okay for you guys? Is it annoying? Some rustling. Sorry about that. So for swine brucellosis, we see similar patterns. So if you remember from the national scale, we see about 5.5% to 15%. If again, we use Texas as an example, at the state aggregate, we see 1% to 5% seropositivity. And if we break it down at the county level, we see some counties with no positive samples, many counties with no positive samples, a few with low seroprevalence, and then a couple with really high seroprevalence. So again, we do see non-homogeneous distribution of these pathogens on the landscape. So I wanted to kind of frame that out because we are dovetailing our ASF surveillance within our national surveillance framework in terms of what we have access to and how we're surveilling pigs. So we have been working really hard on the ASF front with everybody else in the room, with APHIS, industry, state partners, but ASF is a huge priority from Wildlife Services perspective and a lot of concern around feral swine. So African swine fever in the Western Hemisphere for the first time in many, many years, and Puerto Rico is dangerously close to the island of Hispaniola. So Puerto Rico is unique, as well as the Virgin Islands, but populations on Puerto Rico are much higher. They have a fairly significant feral swine population problem. And so they're largely a product of Vietnamese potbellies that were imported as part of the pet trade, and then have, between kind of Hurricane Maria really exacerbated the problem with lots of displaced people and homes, but there are lots of feral swine living on the island of Puerto Rico. So we have been doing rolling deployments for almost 2 years now, doing feral swine work extensively throughout the island of Puerto Rico, as well as the Virgin Islands, but population densities are really, really different. So in those 2 years, we've taken just under 5,000 feral swine, and again, these are pretty distinct as compared to their counterparts within the continental US, as well as the US territories and islands, but these are primarily potbelly descendants, and they are much more kind of peri-domestic, peri-urban species. Think kind of pigeons in a city center as opposed to our other feral swine, more common feral swine, which behave much more like wildlife. These animals are bedded down up against apartment buildings, they're rummaging in trash cans, they're very accustomed to people, they're very accustomed to trash and that kind of anthropogenic lifestyle. So we sampled just under 3,000 of those animals. We're sampling all adult and subadult animals for both ASF and CSF, as well as doing both PCR and ELISA for both diseases. So really trying to get the best data to support the assertion that we are still ASF and CSF free, given that both of those viruses are now circulating in the Caribbean. For the US Virgin Islands, free-roaming feral swine populations are much, much lower. We have been working extensively there as well, and a lot of that is outreach related. So getting, a lot of them are feral swine that are, well, they're own swine, they're domestic swine-ish, but they're kind of raised in a subsistent, very extrinsic production pattern, and so helping farmers find their pigs and getting those animals fenced in and supporting farmers in those activities, right? We can't go and start dispatching people's pigs. That doesn't go well for relationships in the community. So we've had to rely on a lot of kind of different tools. So Puerto Rico, because we're dealing with an urban swine population, which is really distinct from our kind of normal wildlife services lethal removal, where we're working in pigs in very rural areas. We are actually loading pigs on site alive in these very urban centers, trailering them off site, and then dispatching, sampling, and disposing of carcasses in that capacity, which is very different than what we do with the rest of our wildlife services damage management activities. And then for US Virgin Islands, in addition to kind of making sure a pig is truly feral before dispatching it, a lot of it has been looking for feral swine. And so we're relying on other tools, including environmental DNA, so sampling water pools for evidence of swine DNA, because a lot of the tools that we often rely on, like using drone surveillance or helicopter surveillance from the sky, that doesn't work when you're looking at in a kind of a jungle environment. And so we've really had to be kind of innovative in our approach, both for our operational removals, but then also just determining if feral swine populations are or not present. So, of course, the rest of the continental U.S. is at higher risk for ASF virus, given that it's in the Caribbean than it was before that. And so when we first partnered with veterinary services with regard to looking at feral swine ASF high-risk populations, this was in May of 2022, we rolled out these 4 very high-risk states for an ASF virus introduction surveillance scheme. So not surprisingly, they're 4 Gulf Coast states: Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The blue, orange, and red are associated with low, medium, and high priority from a national surveillance perspective. And then the kind of muddy red-brown color in there is our very high-risk counties. And so in May of 22, we stood up active surveillance for ASF and CSF in those areas. So our normal national surveillance CSF is just antibody-based, but where we're doing ASF and where we're doing ASF surveillance, we're also doing paired CSF surveillance, given that both of those viruses are in the Caribbean. So PCR and ELISA for ASF samples taken from this area. So our very high-risk counties are based on the same risk factors associated with our normal national surveillance activities. We're looking at landfills, seaports, airports, the presence of domestic swine production, and then mail and passenger cargo interdiction data coming specifically from the Caribbean. As I mentioned, we're doing active surveillance, both PCR and ELISA for ASF and CSF to really give us the best epidemiological picture. And then, of course, in the time between ASF being detected in the Caribbean and 9-10 months later when we stood the surveillance, it was we have done a fair amount of ASF genotyping for that specific virus, and it was found to be much less virulent than what our colleagues in Southeast Asia or Europe were dealing with. So also wanting to have optics around CSF, since we are less likely to have a giant die-off event. When we are continuing to do a subset of those surveilled animals for ASF and CSF for our normal national surveillance. So this is kind of where we sit today from an active surveillance in the form of PCR and ELISA for ASF and CSF. The purple counties represent our very high-risk counties based specifically on the risk of introduction coming out of Hispaniola. So Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In May of 2023, so a full year later, we brought the yellow counties online as well as the light blue counties. So yellow counties represent risk counties that are determined to be very high risk for the ASF introduction from a global risk pathways, whereas purple just represents from the Caribbean. And so that we brought on Alabama, California, Oklahoma, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee for global risk pathways. And then the baby blue represents the whole of the US-Mexico border, so California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, as well as the whole of the Florida Gulf Coast. And so those baby blues were determined to be very high risk based on the kind of porous border. We don't know who's coming across and what they're bringing with them, and so we're just erring on the side of caution along the southern border and the Florida Gulf Coast. So at this time, these are the counties where we're doing feral swine surveillance, PCR and ELISA based for ASF and CSF, in addition to our national surveillance activities. So this is that same data, presented 2 ways on this map. Our highest sample numbers, quite predictably, are coming out of the original CONUS states, so Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They've had a whole year of head start for our ASF sampling numbers. And so this is a cluster map representing where samples are coming from. The larger the dot, the more samples have been collected. And so, like I said, the 4 original CONUS states are associated with higher samples, but this sampling scheme is kind of, as far as we can tell, here to stay for some time. So in terms of how we're thinking about an ASF response plan in feral swine, it's been a fairly Herculean lift, to be honest with you. We've been working in super close partnership with other components of APHIS as well as state industry partners on what this should look like, representing that there's certainly a shared space where ASF being in ferals or domestics doesn't occur within a vacuum, as Miranda talked extensively about. So from kind of a 50,000 foot view is the ASF Red Book. It really talks about high level about thinking about ASF breaching the U.S. And it's really, really domestic swine oriented with just a couple of sentences about feral swine and what we could anticipate. So when we think about foreign animal disease introduction event in wildlife, it's very distinct than how we think about it in domestics. Controlling and managing pathogens in free-ranging feral or wild species is really challenging. I think a lot of our European countries, we're watching them deal with the challenges in real time. Of course, having ASF or any other FAD in wild or feral species makes control in domestics much more challenging. And then we're often lacking some really basic information for managing disease, like population estimates or density estimates or movement information. So we've been working super hard to try to kind of tease out all the things we can tease out in advance of an ASF breach. And so kind of thinking about it from a 50,000 down to the 10,000 level, which is what we've been doing for the last 2 years. Still certainly plenty of questions, gaps in knowledge. But the first big thing is detecting the virus on the landscape. And so originally we were thinking, in 2018, 2019, when the ASF virus was kind of slowly marching into Western Europe and China and then throughout Southeast Asia, this was a highly virulent strain. We're thinking, okay, well, at least we'll have a die-off. Certainly like between vultures, the smell, the bugs, hunters, birders, hikers, dogs on the landscape, we'll pick it up, no problem. Well, that was maybe best case scenario, right? That we'd get a super virulent strain from a feral swine perspective. But looking at the strain that's in the Caribbean, there's certainly a chance that we get a less virulent strain in the event of an outbreak, and so that will be much more difficult to detect. Wildlife are notoriously stoic, and if we use, say CWD as an example, we have populations of cervids that have north of 25% positivity for CWD, and you just don't see carcasses on the landscape. You don't go hiking and see dozens of dead deer, and so that's really distressing from a detection perspective. So that first lift of detecting the virus on the landscape is not going to be minuscule. The next thing, and the Europeans have kind of demonstrated this on a number of occasions, determining the extent of spread is really important from a management perspective. Making sure that you're not driving pigs into an infected area or out of an infected area is really important. So doing a lot of reconnaissance on where the virus is, where the virus isn't, is really important from a control and mitigation standpoint. Carcass removal. Carcasses are a huge problem. Carcass-based transmission has been demonstrated time and time again, especially in the European kind of ecosystem, that it allows it allows a virus to overwinter quite successfully, and so managing carcasses is really important. Testing those carcasses and disposing of them in a meaningful way. So none of these things are particularly trivial. Probably the simplest is feral swine population reduction, just because we do that all the time. So again, thinking about these kind of broad strokes things where it's like, oh, there's just these quick 4 steps, but then you kind of start going through the details of these steps, and like I said, none of them are trivial. So the Red Book outlines the response zones, and these are mirrored in both domestic and feral swine. So we're looking at, in this case, the X is either a apparently healthy animal that tested positive for ASF or found dead. Anyway, this is an ASF positive individual. The first 3 kilometers around that animal is the infected zone. The next 2 are the buffer zone, 2 kilometers. So the first 5 kilometers is the control area, and then the next 5 kilometers is surveillance zone. And so the whole of this area makes up the response zone, and it's 10 kilometers. What's important to note, and a really important difference between feral swine and domestic swine, is surveillance in feral swine looks just like a control zone, right? We don't sample healthy animals, or we don't sample alive animals. And so from an operational control perspective, this whole 10 kilometers is going to be pretty similar from a response perspective. And so it's 3 nice concentric rings. It seems pretty tidy, but the reality of it is it'll look something like this across some unknown geographical size. So it gets quite unwieldy and quite complicated very quickly. And of course, even if it's just found to be in feral swine, there will be movement restrictions and quarantine restrictions for domestic swine. So there's an overlapping space that shows up quite quickly and gets really complicated. So in terms of how Wildlife Services is thinking about the response goals and what that would look like, we just worked out the ASF feral swine playbook, which really describes this in detail with our partners in veterinary services. So if you're interested, I would recommend that as a kind of the 10,000-foot read of what that would actually look like. But the first thing, as I mentioned, is going to be identifying feral swine populations within that control zone. And so we'll be relying on a lot of tools that Wildlife Services uses already. We'll be using camera grids to determine where populations are. In some, in the southeast, feral swine populations are most everywhere, but that's not the case everywhere. And so making sure we know where those populations are. We also do a fair amount of surveillance from the sky, either through the use of drones or helicopters that we often outfit with thermal equipment. So we are pretty well positioned to find pigs and or carcasses within that control area. The next big thing will be removing feral swine from that area. And so again, relying on tools that Wildlife Services has in place for managing feral swine already. We are already trapping pigs. We're already doing aerial operations. And so just ramping up what we're doing, but being super mindful that in that process of optimizing feral swine reductions, we're not driving pigs off the landscape. So that is going to be, the sweet spot of maximizing efficiency in terms of reducing populations, but not so much so that we're changing behavior, driving pigs off of corn, or moving them outside of the control area. In terms of aerial operations, we always get questions about, when will the helicopters be there? We don't know, right? It all depends. Helicopters don't work particularly well in the late spring, summer, and early fall, where all the leaves are green and the trees are, fluffy and everything's tall and leafed out. And so some geography doesn't allow for it really at all, and then a lot of it is seasonal. So we're really going to have to pull the right tool at the right time, depending on the outbreak, the geography, the season, and the temporality, all of that. Of course, as part of any response plan, conducting ASF surveillance, so doing both PCR and serology to inform our EPI, continuing to do morbidity mortality surveillance in non-control zone areas across the rest of the U.S. during an outbreak to make sure that we're not finding any sick and deads on the landscape. And then demonstrating disease freedom after we think we've eradicated ASF will be a huge lift in feral swine. And then, of course, preventing exposure and infecting additional susceptible animals. So removing carcasses, fencing as a potential option, although, as Miranda mentioned, there's some pretty important considerations there, not only from a logistics, administrative, building fence perspective, but then also implications to other wildlife on the landscape. And then also working with our partners on the domestic side around domestic premises and trying to kind of prevent that spillover, spillback. So from a Wildlife Services perspective, we're thinking about kind of two umbrellas of an ASF introduction. So the first, kind of scenario one, would be that ASF is first detected in domestic swine, whether that be a backyard producer or a slaughter establishment or a commercial facility. But this is that ASF is detected in domestic swine, and we don't have reason to believe that it's spilled over yet. Really going to be responding to that is in a defend the premise, defend the flock perspective, trying to just prevent that spillover. We'll be working, of course, with our partners on the domestic side, state industry partners, but really trying to prevent that spillover into feral swine. And then the other scenario, of course, is that ASF is detected first in feral swine. And so this would be either through our active surveillance streams or morbidity mortality. And this would be part of a coordinated multi-agency approach to combat ASF in ferals. So I'm winding down here, but really Wildlife Services, we are dispatching pigs every day out on the landscape. We have a couple thousand folks that are dedicated to wildlife damage management, and a huge part of that is feral swine management. We have a lot of tools in the toolbox that we use to dispatch pigs and to find pigs in low density areas. And so really kind of the meat and potatoes is pulling the right tool to manage the outbreak depending on where it shows up and when it shows up. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. 6 seconds short.
All right, we got time for one question, then we'll cut you loose for a break. And Dr. Brown will stick around and answer any other questions after that.
You had had the new yellow areas on the Mexican border. Is Mexico doing much? Are you partnering with Mexico? Because obviously they're part of the Caribbean as well and have a lot of pigs. So
Yeah, great question. So we are working with both Canada and Mexico. There's a trilateral meeting. There's a transboundary meeting. We're definitely in the space of working kind of cross-border on the feral swine issue. From Mexico, it sounds like we definitely have way more pigs than they do. From everything we can tell, the data is spotty, certainly, that comes out of Mexico. But from everything we can tell, any pigs that show up, cross the Rio Grande and show up in Mexico are usually coming from the U.S. The pigs, we're getting pigs on the north side from Canada, and the pigs on the south side are coming from us. And most of them are hunted as part of like subsistence hunting. And so it doesn't sound best data, right? It's squishy, but the best we have is it's nothing like it is in Texas or other densely populated areas within the U.S. We have been engaged though in that trilateral space and what that looks like and how we can kind of all work together on that, both the invasive side as well as the disease management preparedness side.
are they testing down there?
Not that we can tell. Yeah.
Last question, just wait for the next.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. Sarah Mikesel with the Pig Site. This slide, this page right here that's up, which I'm tickled because that's what my question's about. How do you determine, like, for example, a yellow block that's in there is a global risk versus, a risk from the Dominican or Haiti? Versus, obviously, I can understand the border counties, but what makes something a global risk? Is that like where airports are, or there's some kind of port coming in? I mean, I'm just curious what that creates.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are getting data out of Customs and Border Protection and Plant Protection and Quarantine. And so we know if, say, a traveler is traveling from Hanoi, Vietnam through LAX to Lincoln, Nebraska, and they're traveling with homemade pork sausage that's confiscated at LAX. In the absence of that confiscation event, the risk would have been in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so we have all of that data. We know that we're only confiscating a fraction of illegally imported products, but we basically use that to upscale where the risk would be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so there are it's landfills, seaports, those are all contributors, but then we're also, there's like pockets of individuals from specific countries that have set up, there's community, yeah, that's what the word I'm looking for, communities of populations of individuals from different areas, and so those would be higher risk, and so we can account for that with the data, even though we know it's just a fraction of what is actually illegally imported. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I have one quick follow-up, I'm sorry. When you talk about wild boar being tested, right, I just wasn't clear on this. Are you testing, so first of all, are those just from hunting? Like, if people are hunting wild boar, let's say in the South, whether it's for, places that are set up for hunting or whether it's just people who are hunting, is there some kind of process for that? And I have one other very quick question. I'm sorry, I have like a million questions. But my second question is kind of, how confident are we in the map, right? We saw how Canada is right on the border, and you've only got one block up there. I kind of question the validity of the map as it exists today.
Yeah.
And so I know those are USDA numbers, and that's what everybody's using, but it doesn't make sense that our borderline is stopping feral pigs, right?
Yeah, no, that's fair. I'm trying to think, I can't remember what your first question was.
Just about hunting.
Oh, hunting.
Yeah.
So these are all, none of it is hunter harvest. It's all like USDA personnel that are damage management. Yeah. So there's people that are out hunting pigs for fun, or they're paying somebody to do it. We're not collecting samples on those animals. Nope.
That's what you guys are collecting.
Yep.
But you have a concerted effort to remove feral pigs from the population. Those are the ones that you
Yes.
guys are testing.
Yep. Yep. And as far as the map, your point is well taken. We have had a few pigs that have been showing up in Montana in specific, but we have not that they're respecting geopolitical boundaries, but we are like very regularly surveilling along the northern border. So we just established an aerial hub in North Dakota, and we're flying that border, those states quite regularly. We have found some carcasses up there, but yeah,
I know it's a couple years old. I heard Ryan give this presentation, Dr. Brooks, at, I think Iowa State, right, a couple years ago. I might be wrong on that. But even just the people at our event from Iowa and the general Midwest were like, that map is not
Doesn't
clearly
feel like it, right?
reflecting, like,
Yep.
we live in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and we see wild boar, right?
Right.
And it just was an interesting
Right.
observation, I think.
Right. All right, let's thank Dr. Brown again for a presentation. We'll be on break until the next round of breakouts will stop